Welcome to the Ghastly Journal. Tonight we delve into a shadowy corner of American history, to a time when the new republic was finding its footing and fortunes were being made by those bold enough, or perhaps dark enough, to seize opportunity. When the ink on the Constitution was barely dry and the whispers of liberty still echoed through the 13 states, another kind of whisper spread through the drawing rooms and back alleys of Charleston. Whispers of a family whose rise to prominence defied all natural explanation. Whispers of midnight gatherings and strange lights in the marshlands. Whispers of people who vanished without trace. This is the tale of the Bellamy Dynasty and the secret cult behind their millions. The year was 1790. South Carolina's coastal region glistened with wealth born of rice plantations and maritime trade. The Revolution had come and gone, leaving behind a nascent country filled with promise and ambition. The streets of Charleston bustled with merchants and sailors, politicians and planters, all navigating the delicate balance between the old aristocratic ways and the new democratic ideals. Carriages clattered over cobblestone streets, their wheels splashing through puddles left by afternoon thunderstorms. Ladies in fine silk gowns strolled beneath parasols, while gentlemen in tailored waistcoats and breeches discussed business on the steps of the Exchange Building. Yet beneath the veneer of civilization, older powers stirred. In the swamps and forests beyond the city limits, remnants of ancient beliefs mingled with new superstitions. Slaves brought from West Africa whispered to their children of spirits and powers that the white masters could never understand. And in certain drawing rooms, behind locked doors, wealthy men and women dabbled in mysteries far removed from their Christian professions. None knew these mysteries better than the Bellamy family of Raven's Rest Plantation, some 20 miles northwest of Charleston. Their grand white-columned mansion stood atop a gentle rise, surrounded by vast fields of Carolina gold rice that stretched to the horizon, shimmering like a green-gold sea in the southern breeze. By day, the plantation appeared the very picture of southern prosperity and genteel living. By night, particularly when the moon hid her face, it became something else entirely. Thaddeus Bellamy arrived in the colonies in 1760, a man of modest means but extraordinary vision. The records in Charleston's maritime office describe him as a merchant of London, approximately 30 years of age, with one vessel to his name. That vessel, the Midnight Star, was a three-masted schooner that had seen better days, its hull barnacled and its sails patched in dozens of places. Yet within a year of his arrival, Thaddeus had established a profitable trade route between Charleston, Jamaica, and Barbados. Where other merchants lost ships to storms or pirates, the Midnight Star always returned to port, its hold filled with exotic goods that fetched premium prices. Some said Thaddeus had an uncanny ability to predict the weather, always sending his ship out just before fair winds and calling it back to harbor before tempests struck. Others claimed he had made arrangements with the pirates who plagued the shipping lanes, offering them something more valuable than cargo in exchange for safe passage. A few whispered darker theories, that Thaddeus had ways of ensuring favorable conditions, rituals performed in the privacy of his counting house as the moon waned to darkness. Within a decade, he had established himself as a merchant of note. His ships, for the Midnight Star, had been joined by 5 sister vessels, plying the Atlantic with remarkable success. His counting house on East Bay Street employed a dozen clerks, and his name appeared on the membership rolls of Charleston's exclusive St. Cecilia Society, despite the mysterious circumstances of his background. When asked about his family in England, Thaddeus would smile his tight-lipped smile and change the subject, leaving his questioner with the distinct impression that further inquiry would be most unwelcome. By 1775, as revolutionary fervor swept through the colonies, Thaddeus had amassed enough wealth to purchase Raven's Rest, a failing plantation whose owner, Sir William Hargrove, had fled back to England, fearing the coming conflict. The estate had fallen into disrepair, its fields untended and its slave quarters half empty. The main house, once the pride of the region, had suffered from neglect, its paint peeling and its gardens overgrown. Most disturbing to the locals was the ancient stone structure at the edge of the property, a relic from the previous century that some claimed had been built by Spanish explorers, while others insisted it predated European settlement entirely. The local Kuso-Natchez tribes avoided the building, calling it the house where shadows live. Hargrove had used the building as a storehouse, though his overseer confided to neighbors that the master never ventured inside after sunset. Thaddeus, however, took an immediate interest in the structure. Within days of taking possession of Raven's Rest, he had the building cleared out and refurbished, ordering iron brackets installed in the walls and a heavy oak table positioned in the center of the single room. When questioned about his plans for the building, Thaddeus claimed it would serve as a special processing facility for a new strain of rice he intended to cultivate, a strain that required particular handling during certain phases of the lunar cycle. The purchase raised eyebrows in Charleston society. Despite his wealth, Thaddeus was still considered something of an outsider, a merchant attempting to join the planter aristocracy. Moreover, his decision to acquire property as tensions with England escalated struck many as foolhardy. Rice plantations required significant labor to maintain, and war would inevitably disrupt both the workforce and the export markets. Yet Thaddeus seemed unconcerned by these considerations, proceeding with renovations to the main house and the acquisition of additional slaves, with the confidence of a man who knew exactly how events would unfold. While other plantations suffered during the war, Raven's Rest flourished. The British blockade that strangled Charleston's harbor seemed to have little effect on Thaddeus's operations. Somehow his ships continued to slip through, bringing supplies that he distributed judiciously, always with an eye toward building goodwill and influence. When British forces occupied Charleston in 1780, Thaddeus maintained cordial relations with the officers while secretly providing intelligence to the Continental forces. When the occupation ended, he was equally welcome in the homes of patriots, his wartime loyalty seemingly beyond question despite his English origins. More remarkable was the prosperity of the plantation itself. Thaddeus seemed to have an uncanny ability to avoid British patrols, and his crops never failed, even when drought or flood devastated neighboring lands. The slaves at Raven's Rest, who had arrived sullen and rebellious, worked with an efficiency that bordered on the unnatural. They moved through the fields in eerie silence, their eyes downcast, responding to overseers' commands with immediate obedience. Visitors commented on their unusual behavior, but Thaddeus would merely smile and attribute it to his enlightened management techniques. Once a month, coinciding with the new moon, Thaddeus would select one of the strongest male slaves and bring him to the stone building for what he called special duties. These men never returned to the slave quarters. When asked about their fate, Thaddeus would explain that they had been sent to work on his ships or sold to plantations further inland. The other slaves never spoke of the missing men, not even in whispers among themselves. Their silence on the matter was perhaps the most unnerving aspect of all. By 1790, Raven's Rest had expanded to encompass over 5,000 acres, its soil producing the finest Carolina gold rice in the region. The once decaying manor house had been transformed into a showcase of wealth and taste, its white columns gleaming in the sunlight, its interiors adorned with imported furnishings and art. Formal gardens surrounded the house, featuring exotic plants that should not have thrived in the Carolina climate but somehow did, their strange blossoms filling the night air with cloying sweetness. Thaddeus was a striking figure, tall and lean with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. At 60 years of age, he retained a vigor that men half his age envied. His thick hair, once the color of polished mahogany, had turned silver at the temples, giving him a distinguished appearance that commanded respect in any gathering. His hands were those of a scholar rather than a planter or merchant, long-fingered and uncalloused, with nails kept immaculately clean despite the dusty business of plantation management. Most remarkable was his voice, a deep, melodious instrument that could charm the wariest negotiator or soothe the most frightened child. When Thaddeus Bellamy spoke, people listened, often finding themselves agreeing to terms they had not intended to accept. His wife Constance was 20 years his junior, a beauty with raven hair and alabaster skin who rarely ventured beyond the plantation's boundaries. She had appeared in Charleston society shortly after the war's end, introduced as the daughter of a French merchant from New Orleans, whom Thaddeus had met on business. They had married quickly, with none of the customary courtship expected of their station. Rumors suggested that Constance had been pregnant at the time of the wedding, though no child arrived until a full year after the ceremony. Constance was as reserved as Thaddeus was sociable. At the rare gatherings she attended, she spoke little, observing the proceedings with dark, knowing eyes that made many guests uncomfortable. She dressed in the height of fashion, yet always in dark colors, midnight blues, deep purples, and blacks that made her pale skin seem to glow in candlelight. Around her throat, she invariably wore a peculiar necklace, a silver pendant etched with symbols that resembled no known alphabet or religious iconography. When asked about it, she would touch it lightly and murmur that it was a family heirloom, too precious to remove. They had 3 children: Nathaniel, the eldest at 25, Victoria 22, and young Thomas, just 16. Each child bore a striking resemblance to one parent. Nathaniel inherited his father's height and commanding presence. Victoria possessed her mother's ethereal beauty, and Thomas seemed a perfect blend of both, with Thaddeus's piercing eyes set in a face that echoed Constance's delicate features. The Bellamys were known for their philanthropy, funding the construction of churches and schools throughout the region. St. Michael's Church received a magnificent new pipe organ, donated by Thaddeus in 1787. The Charleston Orphan House, founded in 1790, counted Constance among its most generous benefactors. A school for the daughters of less fortunate gentlemen opened its doors thanks to Victoria Bellamy's patronage, while Nathaniel sponsored the construction of a new wing at the city's hospital. These acts of generosity earned the family the gratitude of Charleston's citizens and the admiration of their peers. Few questioned the source of the Bellamy's seemingly inexhaustible wealth, accepting Thaddeus's explanation of fortunate investments and efficient plantation management. They hosted lavish gatherings at Raven's Rest, where the elite of Charleston society would marvel at the family's art collection and the strange antiquities Thaddeus had gathered during his travels. Displayed in glass cases throughout the mansion were artifacts that any museum would covet: Egyptian canopic jars, their animal-headed stoppers watching visitors with empty eyes, Grecian amphorae decorated with scenes of bacchanalian excess, African masks whose expressions seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, pre-Columbian stone carvings depicting rituals too disturbing for close examination. Thaddeus would guide his guests through this private museum with evident pride, sharing tales of each item's acquisition and significance. These stories often hinted at dangers overcome and forbidden knowledge obtained, though Thaddeus was careful never to cross the line into impropriety. He presented himself as a scholar of ancient civilizations, particularly interested in their religious practices and beliefs about the afterlife. Most guests found his enthusiasm charming, if perhaps a trifle eccentric for a plantation owner and merchant. The highlight of these gatherings was always the dinner, served in the grand dining room beneath a chandelier of Venetian crystal. The table, capable of seating 30, gleamed with silver and fine china. Footmen in livery moved silently around the guests, filling wine glasses with vintages imported directly from France and serving courses prepared by a chef brought from New Orleans. The food was exquisite, though some dishes featured flavors unfamiliar even to the well-traveled guests. When complimented on a particularly unusual spice or preparation, Thaddeus would smile enigmatically and mention connections to traders from the Far East or Caribbean herbalists who supplied his kitchen with rare ingredients. Yet whispers followed the family like persistent shadows. Why did the laborers at Raven's Rest never attempt escape when those at other plantations regularly fled? Why did Thaddeus insist on maintaining the crumbling stone structure at the edge of the property, a remnant from the previous century that locals called the Witch House? And what occurred during the new moon, when no visitors were permitted at Raven's Rest and even trusted house servants were confined to their quarters? Our story truly begins with the arrival of Dr. Jonathan Blackwood to the Charleston area in early 1790. A physician trained at the University of Edinburgh, Blackwood had come to America seeking new opportunities after a scandal had forced him to leave Scotland. The nature of this scandal remains obscured by time, but rumors suggested it involved forbidden research into the reanimation of dead tissue, inspired by the experiments of Luigi Galvani, whose work on animal electricity had fascinated and disturbed the medical community in equal measure. Blackwood was a man of science in an age when the boundaries between science, philosophy, and what we might now call the occult were still fluid. His personal journals, discovered decades later in a Boston attic, reveal a mind that refused to accept the limitations of conventional wisdom. "There must be more to life and death than the church would have us believe," he wrote. "The electrical fluid that animates our muscles, the essence that departs upon our last breath, these are not supernatural phenomena, but natural processes we have yet to understand. And what can be understood can be manipulated." In appearance, Blackwood cut a striking figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a shock of prematurely white hair that contrasted with his youthful face. He dressed simply but well, favoring dark colors that complemented his serious demeanor. His hands, large and capable, possessed the steadiness required of a surgeon, while his eyes, gray as a winter sea, missed nothing. He spoke with the slight burr of Edinburgh's Old Town, an accent that Charleston's citizens found both foreign and charming. Blackwood established a practice in Charleston where his medical knowledge and Scottish charm quickly earned him entry into society. His treatments, combining traditional methods with progressive techniques, produced results that other physicians could not match. He was particularly successful in treating fevers and infections, using tinctures and compounds of his own devising. If some patients reported unusual dreams or sensations following his treatments, these side effects were considered a small price to pay for recovery from ailments that might otherwise prove fatal. It was at a springtime ball at the governor's mansion that he first encountered the Bellamys, specifically Victoria Bellamy, whose beauty and wit captivated the physician. The event was a celebration of South Carolina's ratification of the Constitution, bringing together the state's most prominent families in a display of patriotic unity. The ballroom glittered with candlelight reflected in crystal chandeliers and ladies' jewels. Musicians played minuets and country dances while servants circulated with trays of champagne and delicacies. Victoria stood apart from the crowd, not merely because of her beauty, though that was considerable, but because of the intensity that surrounded her like an aura. While other young women tittered behind fans and cast demure glances at potential suitors, Victoria observed the proceedings with the cool assessment of a chess player considering her next move. Her gown, a deep crimson that bordered on black in the candlelight, was cut in the latest Parisian fashion, its neckline lower than Charleston propriety typically allowed. Around her throat she wore a silver chain with a pendant similar to her mother's, though Victoria's bore different symbols, angular shapes that seemed to draw the eye into their complexity. Blackwood found himself moving toward her as if pulled by an invisible thread. When their eyes met across the room, he felt a jolt of recognition, though he was certain they had never met before. Something passed between them in that moment, a shared understanding perhaps, or a mutual acknowledgement of difference. Whatever it was, it compelled him to approach and request a dance. Their dance was the talk of Charleston for weeks afterward, the elegant doctor and the plantation heiress moving across the floor with such grace that other dancers stopped to watch. They barely spoke during the minuet, communicating instead through glances and the subtle pressure of hands touching during the figures of the dance. When the music ended, Victoria smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face from beautiful to breathtaking. "You're not like the others, Dr. Blackwood," she said, her voice low and melodious. "You see beyond the veil that blinds most men." "And what veil is that, Miss Bellamy?" he asked, intrigued. "The comfortable illusion that we understand the world and our place in it." She glanced around at the other guests. "These people live in a dollhouse of their own making, playing at lives they believe are important. But there are greater powers at work, greater purposes to serve." Her dark eyes returned to his. "I think you know this already." Before he could respond, Thaddeus Bellamy appeared at his daughter's side, his silver-streaked hair gleaming in the candlelight. "Victoria, my dear, you must introduce me to your new acquaintance," he said, though his expression suggested he already knew exactly who Blackwood was. In the days that followed, Blackwood found himself thinking of Victoria constantly. Her enigmatic words had stirred something within him, a recognition of his own dissatisfaction with conventional explanations for life's mysteries. He had come to America hoping to escape the constraints of European thinking, to find new approaches to old questions. Perhaps the Bellamys, with their evident unorthodoxy, might offer insights he had not considered. He began to ride out to Raven's Rest, ostensibly to treat minor ailments among the household, but truly to catch glimpses of the enchanting young woman. His first visit came in response to a convenient summons. Constance Bellamy was suffering from migraines, and the family's regular physician was unavailable. Blackwood arrived at the plantation on a morning in late April, the air heavy with the scent of magnolia blossoms and the drone of bees among the flowering bushes that lined the drive. A slave met him at the door, a middle-aged man whose face bore no expression whatsoever, not even the customary mask of deference that slaves typically adopted in the presence of whites. The man's eyes seemed unfocused, looking at Blackwood yet not seeing him. When he spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of the musical cadence that characterized the speech of most Carolina slaves. "The mistress awaits you in her chambers, doctor," he said, the words precise yet mechanical. "Follow me." As Blackwood moved through the house, He noted the unusual silence. A home this size typically buzzed with activity, servants cleaning and cooking, children or pets making their presence known, the hundred small sounds of domestic life. Raven's Rest, by contrast, seemed to absorb sound, the thick carpets and heavy draperies creating an atmosphere more like a church than a home. Constance Bellamy's bedroom was a study in controlled light. The windows were covered with layers of curtains that admitted only the faintest illumination, casting the space in a perpetual twilight. The air smelled of incense, not the frankincense of Christian worship, but something more exotic, a blend of spices and resins that Blackwood could not identify. Constance herself lay on a canopied bed, her dark hair spread across the pillows, her pale skin almost luminous in the dim light. "Dr. Blackwood," she murmured as he entered, her voice surprisingly strong for one supposedly suffering from severe headaches. "How kind of you to attend me." Blackwood approached the bedside, medical bag in hand. "Mrs. Bellamy, I understand you've been experiencing migraines." "Among other ailments," she replied, her dark eyes assessing him with an intensity that belied her supine position. "But I find my condition improving already, now that you're here." The examination that followed was unlike any Blackwood had conducted before. Constance answered his questions with cryptic statements that seemed designed to provoke rather than inform. When he inquired about the duration of her headaches, she smiled and said, "Time is such a flexible concept, don't you agree, doctor? What feels like moments to one consciousness might be eternities to another." When he asked about the quality of the pain, she described it as the pressure of knowledge seeking release. Throughout the examination, Blackwood had the distinct impression that he was the one being evaluated rather than the patient. Constance watched his every move with those fathomless eyes, seeming to note his reactions to her strange responses. At one point, she reached out and grasped his wrist with surprising strength, her fingers pressing against his pulse. "Your heart beats with unusual regularity, doctor," she observed. "It suggests a man of discipline, or perhaps one whose blood carries something extra." Thaddeus seemed amused by the doctor's interest in his daughter, even encouraging Blackwood to join them for dinner on several occasions. It was during one such dinner in late April that Blackwood first noticed the peculiarities of the Bellamy household. The family drank a strange tea before each meal, served in cups of tarnished silver-bearing symbols Blackwood did not recognize. The servants moved with an eerie synchronicity, their eyes never meeting those of the family or guests. And most disturbing of all, Blackwood could have sworn that as Thaddeus raised his glass in a toast, the older man's reflection in the dining room mirror remained motionless for just a moment too long. After dinner, as was the custom, the men retired to Thaddeus's study for brandy. It was a remarkable room, its walls lined with books in languages Blackwood recognized but could not read: ancient Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and others whose alphabets were entirely foreign to him. The shelves reached from floor to ceiling, accessible by a rolling ladder that Thaddeus used with the agility of a much younger man when retrieving volumes for reference during their conversations. Glass cases displayed objects that belonged in a museum: Egyptian scarabs, their iridescent shells gleaming in the firelight, Roman coins, the faces of long-dead emperors staring blindly upward, arrowheads of obvious antiquity, their stone points still sharp enough to draw blood, clay tablets covered in cuneiform script, and most striking of all, a dagger whose curved blade seemed to absorb rather than reflect the candlelight. The handle of this weapon was carved from some dark material, not wood or bone, but something that resembled obsidian yet possessed a subtle flexibility when touched. Wrapped around this handle was a thin wire of gold, inscribed with symbols similar to those on the teacups. The study smelled of leather and parchment, pipe tobacco and beeswax, creating an atmosphere of scholarly comfort that belied the strangeness of its contents. A fire burned in the large fireplace, though the evening was mild, casting dancing shadows across the oriental carpet. Thaddeus offered Blackwood a seat in one of two leather armchairs positioned before the hearth, then poured generous measures of brandy from a crystal decanter. "You seem a man of considerable learning, Dr. Blackwood," Thaddeus observed, settling into the other chair. "Edinburgh is known for its medical school, of course, but I sense your studies extended beyond the conventional curriculum." Blackwood sipped his brandy, considering his response. The liquor was exceptional, warming his throat and spreading a pleasant heat through his chest. "I've always believed that medicine must embrace new ideas to advance," he said carefully. "Some of my research in Scotland was considered unorthodox. Unorthodox enough to necessitate your departure, I understand. Thaddeus smiled, showing teeth that seemed too white and perfect for a man of his age. You needn't be concerned. Charleston society is far less rigid than Edinburgh's. Here, a man of vision may pursue his interests without the constraints of old-world thinking. He leaned forward, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. Tell me, Doctor, have you continued your experiments since arriving in America? The question startled Blackwood. He had been discreet about his past, offering only vague explanations for his relocation. I'm not sure what you've heard, Mr. Bellamy, but I make it my business to know about interesting newcomers to Charleston, Thaddeus interrupted smoothly, particularly those with minds that might appreciate the kind of knowledge I've accumulated. He gestured to the shelves surrounding them. These books contain wisdom that most men cannot comprehend, secrets of life and death, of time and dimension, of powers that the Church has spent centuries trying to suppress. You have quite the collection, Mr. Bellamy, Blackwood remarked, gesturing to a particularly unusual item, a small statue of a seated figure with the head of a bird. The statuette was made of a greenish metal that resembled tarnished copper but seemed to shift hue as the firelight played across its surface. Despite its small size, no larger than a man's hand, it possessed a presence that drew the eye and held it. Ah, yes, Thaddeus replied, his voice smooth as honey. A gift from an associate in New Orleans. It is said to represent one of the Loa, the spirits of Vodou. The Africans brought their gods with them to these shores, you know. Old gods. Hungry gods. He lifted the statuette from its place, cradling it with a reverence that bordered on devotion. This particular deity is associated with crossroads and transitions, with doors between worlds. The natives of Saint-Domingue call him Baron Samedi, though he has older names, much older. Thaddeus passed the statuette to Blackwood, who was surprised by its weight and the cold that emanated from the metal despite the warmth of the room. As his fingers closed around it, he felt a subtle vibration, as if the object contained some interior movement or energy. For just a moment he thought he saw the bird-headed figure turn slightly to look at him, but the impression vanished when he blinked. Remarkable craftsmanship, Blackwood murmured, returning the unsettling object to Thaddeus. The level of detail suggests a highly developed artistic tradition. Indeed, Thaddeus replaced the statuette in its case with evident care. These primitive cultures possess knowledge that would astonish our so-called civilized society. They understand that the world we perceive is merely the surface of a much deeper reality, that there are entities and energies beyond our normal senses. He smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. Do you believe in old gods, Dr. Blackwood? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. Blackwood felt himself at a crossroads of his own, one path leading to conventional platitudes about Christian faith, the other into territory that might be dangerous, but also illuminating. His scientific curiosity warred with an instinctive caution. I believe, he said finally, that human history is longer and stranger than our current philosophies acknowledge. Whether the powers our ancestors worshipped were divine or simply natural phenomena, they lacked the vocabulary to explain. That remains an open question. Thaddeus's smile widened, revealing those two perfect teeth again. A diplomatic answer, Doctor. But I think you and I both know that some questions can only be answered through direct experience. He raised his glass, to open minds and new discoveries. Before Blackwood could respond, Nathaniel Bellamy entered the study, his face flushed with anger, or perhaps fear. Unlike his father's controlled elegance, Nathaniel's entrance was abrupt, the door banging against the wall as he thrust it open. His clothing was disheveled, his waistcoat unbuttoned and his neckcloth askew, as if he had dressed in haste. Most striking was his expression, a combination of panic and resignation that transformed his usually handsome features into a mask of distress. Before Blackwood could answer, Nathaniel Bellamy entered the study, his face flushed with anger or perhaps fear. Father, he said tersely, there's been an incident at the witch house. Jenkins says it cannot wait until morning. The change in Thaddeus was immediate and striking. The urbane host vanished, replaced by something colder and more calculating. His eyes narrowed, the blue seeming to darken to almost black in the firelight. His posture stiffened, the relaxed comfort of moments before giving way to a coiled tension that reminded Blackwood of a predator preparing to strike. What kind of incident? Thaddeus asked, his voice low and controlled. Nathaniel glanced at Blackwood, clearly reluctant to speak in front of the visitor. One of the subjects has experienced an unexpected reaction to the treatment. Jenkins attempted the usual corrective measures without success. I see. Thaddeus set down his brandy glass with deliberate care. And the timing? Less than an hour ago. Jenkins says the pattern is unprecedented. Nathaniel's voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying an anxiety that his forced composure could not entirely conceal. A shadow crossed Thaddeus's face, a flicker of something that might have been genuine concern or merely irritation at the disruption. Very well. Please excuse me, Doctor. Nathaniel will keep you company. With that, he swept from the room, his movements fluid and purposeful, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Nathaniel crossed to the brandy decanter, his hands visibly shaking as he poured himself a measure. Unlike his father, the younger Bellamy was stocky and red-faced, with none of Thaddeus's aristocratic bearing. Where Thaddeus moved with predatory grace, Nathaniel's gestures were abrupt and forceful, betraying a temperament more suited to action than contemplation. His eyes, a paler blue than his father's, darted around the room as if seeking escape from an uncomfortable situation. He drained the glass in one swallow, then immediately refilled it. The brandy seemed to steady him somewhat, the flush in his cheeks fading from alarm to mere discomfort. Finally, he turned to Blackwood, attempting a smile that came across as more of a grimace. "So you're the physician who's been calling on my sister," he said abruptly, dropping into the chair his father had vacated. "Victoria has mentioned you several times." "I admire Miss Bellamy greatly," Blackwood replied cautiously, unsure of Nathaniel's mood or intentions. "She has a remarkable mind." Nathaniel snorted, a surprisingly inelegant sound. "That she does. Too remarkable, some might say. She takes after father in that regard." He studied Blackwood with narrowed eyes. "What exactly are your intentions toward my sister, Doctor?" "My intentions are honorable," Blackwood replied, somewhat stiffly. "I enjoy Miss Bellamy's company and conversation. Beyond that, I would not presume without your father's blessing. I admire Miss Bellamy greatly," Blackwood replied cautiously. Nathaniel refilled his glass. "A word of advice, Doctor. There are things about this family you would not understand, things that would disturb you. Victoria is not for you or any man outside our circle. Best you focus your attentions elsewhere." The warning was clear, but it only intensified Blackwood's curiosity. What circle did Nathaniel refer to? What aspects of the Bellamy family would disturb an educated man of science? Before he could frame a response that might elicit more information without seeming confrontational, a sound shattered the tense atmosphere. A scream echoed from somewhere on the grounds, a sound of such terror and agony that both men started. It was not the cry of an animal or the shout of a worker disciplined for some infraction. This was the sound of a human being in the extremity of suffering, a wail that began as a word, perhaps please or no, and dissolved into a raw expression of pain that raised the hair on Blackwood's arms. The scream lingered, seeming to bounce off the walls of the study, then cut off with such suddenness that the silence afterward felt like a physical pressure against the eardrums. Nathaniel's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. Amber liquid splashed across the oriental carpet, the sharp smell of brandy rising to mingle with the room's scholarly odors. Nathaniel made no move to clean up the spill, his eyes fixed on the window that faced toward the rear of the property, toward the witch house. "What in God's name was that?" Blackwood demanded, rising to his feet. His medical instincts urged him toward the source of the cry, toward whatever suffering required his attention and skill. "Nothing," Nathaniel replied too quickly, his voice higher than normal. "One of the kitchen boys likely scalded himself. Nothing for you to concern yourself with, Doctor." But his hand trembled as he reached for the decanter, belying his casual explanation. "That was no kitchen accident," Blackwood insisted. "Someone is in serious distress. As a physician, You should finish your brandy and prepare to return to Charleston." Nathaniel interrupted, his tone hardening. "It's growing late, and the roads can be treacherous after dark. Our overseer will see to any injuries among the servants." The tension between them stretched taut as a bowstring. Blackwood knew he was being dismissed, knew that pressing the issue would likely end his welcome at Raven's Rest. Yet the scream had awakened every professional instinct he possessed, along with a deeper human concern that transcended social niceties. Someone on the Bellamy plantation was suffering terribly, and Nathaniel's transparent lie suggested the family's involvement or at least knowledge of the cause. "I think perhaps I should speak with your father before departing," Blackwood said carefully. "If there has been a serious accident, father is occupied and cannot be disturbed," Nathaniel cut in. rising from his chair with surprising speed for his stocky build. "I insist, doctor. Your horse will be brought around immediately." Blackwood made his excuses shortly thereafter, recognizing that further resistance would only close doors he wished to keep open. Nathaniel summoned a slave to escort him to the front of the house, where another servant had already brought his horse. The night had grown cool, a mist rising from the fields to veil the distant trees in ghostly white. The moon, just past full, cast enough light to illuminate the path back to Charleston, though shadows pooled beneath the live oaks that lined the drive. As he prepared to mount, a movement at the side of the house caught his attention. A figure in pale clothing darted between columns, heading toward him with evident purpose. It was Victoria, her white dress billowing around her like a cloud in the moonlight. Her dark hair, usually confined in the elaborate styles favored by Charleston society, hung loose around her shoulders, giving her the appearance of a much younger woman, or perhaps a spirit from local folklore. "Dr. Blackwood," she called softly, glancing back toward the house as if fearing observation. "A moment, please." Blackwood stepped away from his horse, meeting her in the shadow of a massive oak. Up close, he could see that her eyes were wide with an emotion he could not immediately identify. Fear, perhaps, or excitement, or some complex blend of both. Her breathing was rapid, her cheeks flushed. Most striking was her scent. Beneath the expected floral perfume was something metallic and sharp, like copper or iron, like blood. "Miss Bellamy," he began, "I heard a disturbance." "Is everything—" "You must not come here again," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the end of the hall where a servant stood watching. "Father, the things he does, you cannot know. Please, for your own safety, forget me." Her fingers clutched his arm with surprising strength, the nails digging into his sleeve with enough force to reach the skin beneath. Up close, Blackwood noticed something he had missed during their previous encounters: tiny markings at the edge of her hairline, partially concealed by artfully arranged curls. They appeared to be tattoos or perhaps scars, forming patterns similar to the symbols on the silver teacups. "Victoria," he said softly, concern overriding formality, "are you in danger? If someone is hurting you?" She laughed, a sound entirely devoid of humor. "Hurting me? No, doctor. I am becoming. We are all becoming." Her gaze shifted over his shoulder, toward the rear of the property where the witch house stood. "But not everyone survives the process. Not everyone is worthy." "What process?" "Victoria, you're not making sense." Blackwood placed his hands on her shoulders, trying to ground her in reality. Beneath the thin fabric of her dress, her skin felt fever-hot. "The covenant," she whispered, leaning closer, her lips almost brushing his ear. "The older ones demand sacrifice in return for their gifts. Father promised them 13 souls by the dark of the next moon. Tonight was a preparation." She pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting his with desperate intensity. "He sees something in you, doctor. Something useful. If he invites you to a ceremony, refuse. No matter what he offers, no matter how tempting, refuse." With those cryptic words, she hurried away, leaving Blackwood more intrigued than deterred. As he rode back to Charleston beneath a waning moon, he resolved to discover what secrets the Bellamys were hiding at Raven's Rest. Victoria's warning, far from frightening him away, had awakened the same investigative spirit that had driven his research in Edinburgh, a need to understand the hidden mechanisms behind observable phenomena, no matter how disturbing those mechanisms might prove to be. The road back to Charleston was unusually quiet that night. No other travelers passed Blackwood, and even the nocturnal creatures of the woods and fields seemed to have fallen silent. The only sounds were his horse's hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through Spanish moss that draped the ancient oaks like tattered shrouds. Several times he had the distinct impression of being watched, of eyes following his progress from the shadows beside the road. Once a movement in his peripheral vision caused him to rein in sharply, but when he turned to look, he saw only mist drifting between moonlit trees. He reached the outskirts of Charleston just after midnight, the city's perimeter marked by scattered farmhouses and the occasional tavern catering to travelers. As he passed one such establishment, the Sailor's Rest, a commotion erupted, raised voices, the crash of breaking glass, and then a figure staggering out the door and collapsing in the road directly in Blackwood's path. The doctor reined in sharply, dismounting to examine the fallen man. In the spill of light from the tavern's open door, he could see it was a sailor, his clothing bearing the salt stains and tar marks of his profession. The man's face was bruised, blood trickling from a split lip, but what caught Blackwood's attention was the expression of terror in the sailor's eyes. "Help me!" The man gasped, clutching at Blackwood's coat. "They're after me. They know I saw." "Saw what?" Blackwood asked, glancing toward the tavern. Several men stood in the doorway watching but making no move to approach. Their stillness was unnatural, their silhouettes oddly uniform despite differences in height and build. "The ship," the sailor whispered. "Bellamy's ship. The one that docks where no harbor master records it. I was on watch last night. Saw them unloading. Not cargo, not proper cargo. People, chained people, but not slaves for selling. Something worse." His eyes darted past Blackwood, widening further. "They're coming. God help me, they're coming." Blackwood turned to see 3 men approaching from the direction of the tavern, moving with the same eerie synchronicity he had observed among the servants at Raven's Rest. Their faces were expressionless, their gazes fixed on the fallen sailor with predatory focus. One carried a coiled rope, another a heavy cudgel. Standing, Blackwood positioned himself between the approaching men and the injured sailor. "This man needs medical attention," he said firmly. "I am Dr. Jonathan Blackwood, and I am taking him under my care." The men stopped, exchanging glances that seemed to contain an entire silent conversation. The one with the cudgel spoke, his voice as flat and mechanical as that of the slave who had greeted Blackwood at Raven's Rest. "This matter does not concern you, Doctor. The man is drunk and disorderly. We are merely returning him to his ship." "His injuries suggest otherwise," Blackwood replied, helping the sailor to his feet. "If he has committed some offense, take it up with the proper authorities. Until then, he is my patient." For a moment, it seemed the confrontation might turn violent. The 3 men moved closer, forming a semicircle that blocked the road to Charleston. Blackwood tensed, acutely aware that he was outnumbered and unarmed, save for the surgical instruments in his medical bag. The sailor trembled beside him, clearly too injured or frightened to be much help in a physical altercation. Then, unexpectedly, the men stepped back. "Very well, Doctor," said the spokesman, his tone unchanged despite the concession. "But Mr. Bellamy will hear of this interference." With that, they turned and walked back to the tavern, moving in unsettling unison, like puppets controlled by a single set of strings. Blackwood helped the sailor onto his horse, then led the animal the remaining distance to Charleston. The injured man slumped in the saddle. By the time they reached Blackwood's modest home and surgery on Trad Street, the sailor had lapsed into semi-consciousness, muttering about eyes in the darkness and the hungry ones beneath. After settling his patient in the small room reserved for those requiring overnight observation, Blackwood examined him thoroughly. The external injuries were minor, bruises and contusions consistent with a tavern brawl, but the man's pulse was rapid and thready, his skin clammy despite the warm night. Most concerning were his pupils, contracted to pinpoints despite the dim lighting, suggesting he had been drugged. Blackwood administered a tincture to help the man sleep, then sat at his desk to record the evening's events while they remained fresh in his memory. As he wrote, connections began to form in his mind. The Bellamy's strange behavior, the peculiar condition of their servants, Victoria's cryptic warnings, and now this sailor's terror, and the unnatural men who pursued him. Something was happening at Raven's Rest that defied conventional explanation, something that apparently extended to Thaddeus's shipping operations as well. The following week, Blackwood found himself treating Elijah Parker, a Charleston merchant who supplied imported goods to many of the region's plantations, including Raven's Rest. Parker was suffering from gout, a common ailment among the well-fed merchant class, but as Blackwood wrapped the affected foot, the conversation turned to the Bellamys. Parker was a corpulent man in his 50s, with a florid complexion and small, shrewd eyes that missed little. His counting house on the waterfront handled everything from French wines to English textiles to spices from the Far East. Unlike many merchants, who specialized in particular goods or trade routes, Parker dealt in whatever promised a profit, earning him a reputation as both flexible and somewhat unscrupulous. If a customer wanted something, anything, Parker could obtain it, provided the price was right. "Damnable affliction," Parker muttered, wincing as Blackwood wrapped the affected foot in bandages soaked in a solution of willow bark and other herbs. The joint was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin red and shiny with inflammation. "Comes from living too well, they say. Though I notice it's never the ascetics who make such judgments. Always the fellows who enjoy their port and beef as much as I do." Blackwood smiled politely at the attempted humor. "It's certainly aggravated by rich foods and alcohol, though there seems to be a hereditary component as well. Did your father suffer from similar attacks?" "Father, grandfather, great-grandfather," Parker confirmed. Bellamy is the only man I know who seems immune to the family curse, despite maintaining one of the finest wine cellars in South Carolina. He shook his head in obvious envy. Strange folk, he added, wincing as Blackwood adjusted the bandage. Been supplying them for 15 years, and I still don't understand how they've managed it. Managed what? Blackwood asked, keeping his tone casual while his interest sharpened. Here, perhaps, was another thread in the increasingly complex tapestry of the Bellamy mystery. Their success, Parker replied, reaching for the glass of watered brandy Blackwood had permitted him as a concession to the pain of treatment. Thaddeus arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back and a single ship that was barely seaworthy. Now look at him, one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina. And during the war, when everyone was struggling, Raven's Rest only grew. It ain't natural. Blackwood nodded thoughtfully, applying a final layer of bandage before securing it with a pin. I've heard Mr. Bellamy is quite shrewd in his business dealings. Parker snorted, a sound of profound skepticism. Shrewd is one thing. This is something else. His ships never encounter pirates. His crops never fail. His investments always, and I mean always, turn a profit. During the British occupation, when most of us were losing everything that wasn't nailed down, Thaddeus somehow convinced the English officers to leave his property untouched. At the same time, he was feeding information to the Continental Army. Should have been hanged as a spy, but instead, he emerged from the war richer than ever. The merchant leaned forward, lowering his voice as if fearing eavesdroppers despite being in Blackwood's private surgery. And have you noticed how the man hardly seems to age? I swear he looks the same now as he did when I first met him. The merchant leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. My father used to tell tales of the old world, of men who made pacts with the devil for wealth and long life. Sometimes I wonder, surely you don't believe such superstitions, Blackwood said with a forced laugh, though his mind raced with the possible implications. His own research in Edinburgh had led him to explore folklore and mythology, alongside more conventional medical texts, seeking parallels between ancient beliefs and modern science. While he dismissed much as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, certain persistent patterns across cultures had given him pause. Perhaps not, Parker conceded, settling back in his chair. I'm a practical man, Doctor. I deal in goods that can be weighed and measured, valued and sold. But there's something else, something that happened back in '82 that always troubled me. There was a slave revolt planned at several plantations along the Ashley River. Someone betrayed them, and the ringleaders were captured. Most were executed publicly, as a warning to others with similar ideas. He paused, taking another sip of his brandy. But the ones from Raven's Rest, Thaddeus insisted on handling their punishment personally, took them to that old stone building on his property. No one saw those men again, but for weeks afterward, smoke rose from that building day and night, and the smell. Parker shuddered. The smell was not of burning flesh, Doctor. It was something sweeter, more cloying, like flowers rotting in summer heat. Blackwood finished his treatment in silence, his mind racing. As a man of science, he was reluctant to entertain supernatural explanations for the Bellamy phenomena. Yet he had seen enough at Raven's Rest, the servant's unnatural behavior, Thaddeus's reflection moving out of sync with his physical form, the strange tea and symbols, to know that something beyond conventional understanding was occurring. Whether it involved actual demonic pacts or merely obscure scientific or alchemical knowledge, he could not yet determine. But the pattern of disappearances centered around the witch house suggested that whatever the Bellamys were engaged in, it involved human subjects, or perhaps human sacrifice. The sailor's terrified words came back to him. Not cargo, not proper cargo. People, chained people, but not slaves for selling. Something worse. Were the Bellamys importing individuals for some dark purpose beyond ordinary slavery? And what was the covenant Victoria had mentioned, with its demand for 13 souls by the dark of the next moon? That evening he penned a letter to a former colleague at Edinburgh University, inquiring about any research connecting occult practices to the American colonies. While he waited for a reply, he continued his investigations locally, speaking with anyone who had dealings with the Bellamys or Raven's Rest. From the harbor master, he learned that ships owned by Thaddeus often returned from the Caribbean with cargo that was unloaded only at night, by Thaddeus's personal slaves rather than the usual dock workers. From a retired midwife, he heard that Constance Bellamy had not aged a day in 20 years, and that during the birth of her youngest child, The midwife had glimpsed strange markings covering Constance's entire body, markings that seemed to shift and move in the candlelight. Most disturbing was his conversation with Reverend James Sullivan of St. Philip's Church. The elderly clergyman had been in Charleston for over 40 years and remembered when Thaddeus first arrived. Sullivan was a small, stooped man with hands gnarled by arthritis and a face deeply lined by decades of Charleston's harsh summers. Despite his physical frailty, his mind remained sharp, his blue eyes bright with intelligence beneath bushy white eyebrows. Blackwood found him in the church's small library, cataloging donated books with painstaking care. Thaddeus Bellamy, Sullivan mused when Blackwood broached the subject. Now there's a name I haven't discussed in many years, not since the unfortunate business with Laveau. Laveau? Blackwood prompted, the name unfamiliar to him despite his extensive inquiries. Henri Laveau, Sullivan clarified, placing a marker in the volume he had been examining and giving Blackwood his full attention. A Frenchman from Saint-Domingue. He arrived with Thaddeus in 1760. They were inseparable at first, partners in their shipping venture. This was new information. In all his conversations about Thaddeus's origins, no one had mentioned a business partner. What happened to him? Blackwood asked. Sullivan's eyes clouded, his gaze turning inward to some troubled memory. They were inseparable at first, partners in their shipping venture, but after about a year, Laveau disappeared. Thaddeus claimed he had returned to France, but there were rumors that Laveau had discovered something terrible about his partner and threatened to expose him. What sort of discovery? Blackwood pressed, sensing he was finally approaching the heart of the mystery. Sullivan shook his head. I cannot say with certainty, but shortly before his disappearance, Laveau came to me in a state of great distress. He spoke of ancient rituals, of sacrifices made to entities older than Christianity. He claimed Thaddeus had brought something with him from the old world, not an object, but a knowledge, a way of communing with these entities. He was afraid, Doctor, truly afraid. The Reverend's voice dropped to a whisper. A week later, parts of a dismembered body washed ashore near the harbor. The head was never found, so identification was impossible. But I have always wondered. Sullivan fell silent, his gnarled fingers worrying at the cross that hung around his neck. After a moment, he continued, his voice steadier. Laveau left something with me for safekeeping, a journal written in French. He said if anything happened to him, I should ensure it reached the authorities. But when I attempted to fulfill this promise after his disappearance, I found the journal had been stolen from my quarters. The lock on my desk had been forced, and only that item was taken. Do you recall anything specific from your conversations with Laveau? Blackwood asked. Any names or terms that might help me understand what Thaddeus brought with him? Sullivan hesitated, glancing toward the church's stained glass windows as if seeking divine guidance on whether to continue. Finally, he nodded, having apparently reached a decision. Laveau mentioned an organization, the Order of the Eternal Dawn. He said Thaddeus had been initiated into its mysteries in London before coming to the colonies. The order worshipped beings they called the Ancient Ones, or sometimes those who wait beyond. Their ultimate goal was immortality, achieved through rituals that Laveau found abhorrent. And you believe Thaddeus continues these practices at Raven's Rest? Blackwood asked, trying to connect this information with what he had observed and learned. I cannot say with certainty, Sullivan replied carefully, but I have never accepted the invitation to visit Raven's Rest, despite Thaddeus's generous donations to our church. There is something in that man's eyes, Doctor, something that does not belong in a child of God. He reached out, gripping Blackwood's wrist with surprising strength for one so frail. If you are investigating the Bellamys, proceed with extreme caution. The power Thaddeus wields may not be supernatural in origin, but it is real nonetheless. His influence extends throughout Charleston society, into government offices and trading companies, even into the church itself. As Blackwood departed St. Philip's, the Reverend's warning echoed in his mind. He had come to Charleston seeking a fresh start, an opportunity to pursue his research without the constraints and prejudices he had encountered in Edinburgh. Instead, he had stumbled upon a mystery that hinted at practices far darker than anything he had explored in his previous work. In early June, Blackwood received a response from Edinburgh. His colleague wrote that there were indeed accounts of occult practices in the American colonies, particularly in New England during the previous century. He enclosed copies of several documents, including an anonymous journal dated 1692, the year of the Salem witch trials. The journal described a group called the Order of the Eternal Dawn, who sought communion with the older ones, those who dwelled in these lands before mankind crawled from the sea. The journal was written in a spidery hand, its ink faded to brown with age. Blackwood spent an entire evening poring over it, translating the archaic English and deciphering passages where water damage or time had rendered the text nearly illegible. What emerged was a document of profound disturbance, the record of a man who had infiltrated the Order of the Eternal Dawn with the intention of exposing their blasphemies, only to find himself drawn into their mysteries despite his initial revulsion. According to the journal, the order had been founded in England during the previous century, but had established a significant presence in the Massachusetts Bay Colony by the 1680s. They operated under the guise of a philosophical society, attracting educated men who chafed at Puritan restrictions on intellectual inquiry. Their true nature, however, was far from philosophical. They speak of entities that existed before God's creation, the journal recorded, beings of such power and age that our human concepts of morality and sin mean nothing to them. These older ones, as the order names them, are said to dwell in dimensions adjacent to our own, separated by a veil that can be pierced under certain conditions. The rituals I have witnessed involve attempts to create such conditions, to open doors that were sealed by divine providence. The journal described ceremonies conducted during specific astronomical alignments, when stars formed patterns that the order believed weakened the barriers between worlds. These ceremonies invariably involved blood sacrifice, initially animals, but eventually human victims, usually indentured servants or Native Americans, whose disappearance would raise few questions among the colonial authorities. Most disturbing were the accounts of what happened when the rituals succeeded. Something came through, the journal recorded after one such ceremony. I cannot describe its form, for it seemed to shift and change with each movement, defying the constraints of flesh as we understand it. Those who gazed directly upon it fell to their knees, blood streaming from their eyes and ears. Yet Magistrate H approached it without fear, offering the blood he had collected in a silver vessel. In return, the entity touched his forehead with what might have been a limb or a tendril, leaving a mark that glowed like hot iron before fading to a pattern of scars. According to the journal, the order had been driven from Massachusetts following the Salem witch trials, which had begun when one of their rituals went catastrophically wrong, resulting in several young women of the community being exposed to energies that drove them to madness. The afflicted girl's accusations, though directed at innocent parties, had created enough scrutiny that the true cultists were forced to flee south. Most disturbing was the description of the order's inner circle drinking a tea made from a plant native to the Caribbean, which allegedly slowed aging and allowed communion with the entities they worshipped. The tea, brewed under the dark of the moon and mixed with a few drops of human blood, was said to gradually transform those who consumed it regularly. They become something neither fully human nor fully other, the journal explained. Their outward appearance remains unchanged, save for a certain agelessness, but their inner nature is altered beyond redemption. They no longer dream as men dream, but see through eyes not their own when they sleep. They hunger for experiences beyond mortal pleasure, and they hear the voices of the older ones always, whispering promises of power and knowledge in exchange for service and sacrifice. The journal ended abruptly in mid-sentence, suggesting its author had met with an untimely end before completing his account. Accompanying it was a letter from Fraser, expressing his professional opinion that while the document contained obvious elements of religious hysteria and superstition, certain details aligned with other accounts of occult practices in colonial America. Most notably, Fraser had found references to similar rituals in documents from Haiti and Jamaica, where African religious traditions had mixed with European occultism to create syncretic practices focused on communication with powerful entities. "I need hardly remind you, my dear Blackwood," Fraser wrote, "that our scientific understanding of consciousness and its potential remains woefully incomplete. The mind is capable of perceiving realities beyond our conventional senses, a fact demonstrated by the effects of certain compounds on brain function. Whether the entities described in these accounts have objective existence, or are merely projections of the collective unconscious under the influence of psychoactive substances, I cannot say with certainty. But I urge caution in your investigations. Knowledge that shifts our fundamental understanding of reality can be as dangerous as it is valuable, particularly when that knowledge has been jealously guarded by those who would use it for their own advancement." That night, Blackwood dreamed of Victoria Bellamy. In the dream, she stood at the edge of a dark pool, her white nightgown billowing in an unfelt breeze. The water of the pool was black as ink, yet seemed to glow from within, illuminated by lights that moved beneath its surface like enormous fish or serpents. As he approached, Victoria turned to him, her face transforming from beauty to horror, her skin splitting to reveal something ancient and inhuman beneath. From the fissures in her flesh emerged tendrils of darkness that reached toward him, promising knowledge and power beyond mortal comprehension. He awoke drenched in sweat, the image still burning in his mind. Outside his window, the first light of dawn was breaking over Charleston's rooftops, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that belied the darkness of his dream. As he rose and prepared for the day's appointments, Blackwood knew that despite his growing unease, he could not abandon his investigation. Too many lives might depend on uncovering the truth about the Bellamys and their cult. Despite his growing unease, Blackwood could not stay away from Raven's Rest. He continued to manufacture reasons to visit, treating minor ailments among the household and laborers. A slave with a persistent cough provided the perfect excuse to examine the living conditions in the quarters. A kitchen maid who had burned her hand while preparing dinner allowed him access to areas of the main house normally closed to visitors. Each visit yielded small but significant observations. Symbols carved into door frames, patterns in the decorative tiles that echoed the markings on the silver teacups, the way certain rooms seemed colder than others despite the summer heat. During these visits, he attempted to catch glimpses of the mysterious stone building that Parker had mentioned, but it was situated deep within the property, away from the main house and the areas where Blackwood was permitted to go. On several occasions, he considered slipping away from his escort to explore further, but the constant, watchful presence of the Bellamy slaves made such an attempt too risky. These servants, with their blank eyes and mechanical movements, seemed to materialize whenever Blackwood strayed from his expected path, gently but firmly directing him back toward approved areas of the plantation. His interactions with the Bellamy family during these visits were equally constrained. Thaddeus was frequently absent, attending to business in Charleston or traveling to his other properties along the coast. Constance received him with cool politeness when he called to check on her migraines, which she claimed were much improved thanks to his previous treatment. Nathaniel avoided him entirely, making himself scarce whenever Blackwood arrived at Raven's Rest. Victoria, who had so captivated him initially, now seemed to deliberately keep her distance, though he occasionally caught her watching him from windows or through partially open doors, her expression unreadable. It was during one such visit in late June that Blackwood encountered Thomas, the youngest Bellamy son. Unlike his father and siblings, Thomas seemed uncomfortable with the family's position. He was a sensitive boy, more interested in poetry and music than plantation management. Where Nathaniel carried himself with the arrogant confidence of a young man secure in his inheritance and position, Thomas moved through Raven's Rest like a visitor, hesitant and watchful, as if expecting censure for any misstep. Blackwood found him sitting beneath an oak tree near the formal gardens, reading a volume of Milton's Paradise Lost. The boy was so absorbed in the text that he didn't notice Blackwood's approach until the doctor's shadow fell across the page. Thomas started, slamming the book closed with a guilty expression that suggested he expected punishment for his literary interests. "Are you fond of Milton?" Blackwood asked, taking a seat beside the boy. He kept his tone conversational, recognizing in Thomas a potential ally, or at least a source of information less guarded than the other Bellamys. Thomas nodded, relaxing slightly when it became clear that Blackwood was not going to confiscate the book or report his reading habits to Thaddeus. "I find comfort in his words," he said softly, running his fingers over the leather binding. "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Sometimes I feel that way about Raven's Rest." "How so?" Blackwood asked gently, careful not to push too hard too quickly. The boy was clearly troubled, and Blackwood's medical training had taught him the value of patience when dealing with distressed patients. Thomas glanced around, ensuring they were alone. The garden was empty save for a distant slave pruning roses, too far away to overhear their conversation. "This place, it changes people. Father, Nathaniel, even Victoria now. They speak of the family legacy, of power and knowledge passed down through generations. But I've seen what that legacy demands." He shuddered, his young face suddenly appearing much older, lined with worry and fear. "The witch house. They take people there. People who disappear. What happens in that building, Thomas?" Blackwood leaned closer, sensing he was finally approaching the heart of the mystery. The boy's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not supposed to know. I followed Father and Nathaniel one night last year during the dark of the moon. I saw—" He trailed off, his young face contorted with the memory. There was a man tied to a stone table. They were chanting Father and Nathaniel and Victoria and Mother, all wearing red robes. And there were others there too, families from Charleston whose names you would recognize. They cut the man, collected his blood in a silver bowl, and then something came out of the shadows behind the table. Something I couldn't see clearly, but that moved wrong, like it had too many limbs or not enough. Thomas buried his face in his hands. I ran. I've never told anyone what I saw. Father would say I need to be initiated, that I'm old enough now to join the order. But I don't want to. I dream about it. That thing in the shadows. It speaks to me in my sleep, tells me I belong to it. He looked up at Blackwood, his eyes pleading. You have to help me, Doctor. I need to get away from here before the next dark moon. That's when they'll come for me. Blackwood placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling Thomas tremble beneath his touch. The young man's terror was palpable, and Blackwood had no doubt he was telling the truth about what he had witnessed. When is the next dark moon? July 11th, Thomas whispered. Less than 2 weeks from now. They're planning something special, Father says. The stars will be aligned just right. They've been bringing in people for weeks now, keeping them in the cellar beneath the witch house. His voice dropped even lower. I heard Father telling Nathaniel that this ceremony will be the culmination of decades of preparation, that the older ones will bestow their greatest gift upon the faithful, the secret of transformation. Transformation into what? Blackwood asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Something beyond human, Thomas replied. Something that doesn't age or die. Father says it's the next step in our evolution, but he shook his head. I've seen what happens to the servants they choose for special duties. They come back changed. They move differently. Their eyes don't track properly, and they obey without question, no matter what they're ordered to do. The boy clutched Blackwood's arm. I don't want to become like that. I don't want to lose myself. Blackwood's mind raced, processing the implications of Thomas's revelations. The strange behavior of the Bellamy servants, the eerie synchronicity of their movements, the vacant expressions. These were not symptoms of drugging or hypnotic suggestion, as he had initially theorized. Something far more fundamental had been done to these people, something that altered their very essence. I'll help you, Thomas, he promised. We'll find a way to get you safely away from here before the ceremony. But even as he spoke, Blackwood wondered how he could possibly extract the boy from a household that seemed to observe every movement, where the servants themselves might be extensions of some inhuman will. Before Thomas could respond, Victoria appeared on the path before them, her face a mask of calm that did not reach her eyes. She wore a simple walking dress of deep blue, her dark hair coiled at the nape of her neck in a style that emphasized the elegant length of her throat. Around that throat, her silver pendant gleamed in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the oak's branches. Thomas, Mother is asking for you, she said smoothly, her voice betraying no hint that she might have overheard their conversation. And Dr. Blackwood, I believe my father wished to speak with you before you depart. Thomas shot Blackwood a frightened glance before hurrying toward the main house, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Victoria watched him go, her expression softening momentarily with what might have been genuine concern for her younger brother. Then she turned to Blackwood, and any trace of humanity vanished from her features. Her eyes, which had once captivated him with their intelligence and depth, now seemed fathomless, like looking into a well that descended to the center of the earth. You've been asking questions about my family in Charleston, she said without preamble. That is unwise. Blackwood stood, meeting her gaze despite the chill that ran through him at her transformation. The Victoria he had danced with, whose wit and beauty had so entranced him, seemed entirely gone, replaced by something colder and more alien. I'm concerned, Miss Bellamy. For you, for Thomas, for all of you. Whatever your father is involved in, you know nothing of my father or our ways. She interrupted, her voice suddenly harsh. We preserve knowledge that would burn the minds of ordinary men. We commune with powers that existed before your Christian God was ever dreamed of. Victoria, Blackwood said softly, using her given name deliberately, trying to reach whatever remained of the woman he had admired. This isn't you speaking. Whatever influence your father has over you. Influence? She laughed, a cold sound that sent shivers down Blackwood's spine. I am a Bellamy. The blood of the covenant flows through my veins. I have tasted eternity, Doctor. Once you have done so, nothing else satisfies. She stepped closer, her perfume mingling with another scent, something metallic and ancient. "I could show you. Father sees potential in you. You could join us, become one of us, live for centuries instead of decades." "At what cost?" Blackwood demanded. "The lives of innocents? Your own humanity?" Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or a glimmer of the woman Blackwood had first met. For a moment, he thought he might be reaching her, breaking through whatever conditioning or transformation had altered her nature. But it was quickly extinguished, like a candle snuffed by a cold wind. Her face hardened, cheekbones becoming more prominent beneath skin that suddenly seemed too tight, as if something else entirely was wearing Victoria Bellamy like an ill-fitting garment. "Humanity is a brief candle, Doctor," she said, her voice taking on a strange resonance, as if multiple speakers were using her vocal cords simultaneously. "What we offer is an eternal flame." She turned away, her movements suddenly too fluid, too precise to be entirely natural. "Do not come here again unless you are prepared to embrace our path, and stop filling Thomas's head with notions of escape. There is no escape from what we are." As she walked away, Blackwood knew he had to act quickly. Thomas was in danger, and perhaps others as well. Whatever ritual the Bellamys and their cult planned for July 11th, he had to prevent it. But how could one man stand against an organization that had operated in secret for generations, that counted among its members some of Charleston's most influential citizens? The answer, he realized, was that he couldn't, not directly. He needed allies, evidence, and above all, a plan that did not rely on confronting the cult's supernatural patrons on their own terms. If there was one thing his scientific training had taught him, it was that even the most seemingly mystical phenomena had underlying mechanisms that could be disrupted if properly understood. Back in Charleston, Blackwood attempted to interest the authorities in investigating Raven's Rest, but without success. The Bellamys were too well connected, their donations having filled the pockets of every official in the region. When he spoke of human sacrifice and dark rituals, he was met with skepticism or outright derision. One magistrate even suggested that perhaps Blackwood should seek treatment for his own mental state, implying that the Charleston climate sometimes adversely affected those not born to it. "These are serious accusations, Dr. Blackwood," the magistrate said, leaning back in his leather chair with an expression of barely concealed amusement. "Thaddeus Bellamy is one of our most respected citizens. His contributions to this community are beyond question, and you expect me to believe he's conducting human sacrifices on his property? Based on what evidence?" "The testimony of his own son," Blackwood insisted, "and the mysterious disappearances of laborers from Raven's Rest. Speak to Elijah Parker, or Reverend Sullivan. They have concerns as well." "Parker is a gossip and a drunk," the magistrate dismissed, "and Sullivan is a doddering old man whose mind wanders more often than not these days. No, Doctor, I think what we have here is a case of an overactive imagination combined with perhaps a touch of professional jealousy." He smiled thinly. "After all, the Bellamys don't lack for anything, do they? While you, a newcomer to our city, are still establishing yourself, it's only natural to wonder how others achieved what you yourself desire." Only when Blackwood mentioned the sailor who had witnessed unusual unloadings from Bellamy ships did the magistrate's demeanor change. The amusement vanished, replaced by a cold watchfulness that reminded Blackwood uncomfortably of Thaddeus himself. "I think we've discussed this matter long enough," the magistrate said, rising from his chair. "Let me offer you some friendly advice, Doctor. Charleston is a close-knit community. Those who prosper here understand the importance of discretion and respect for their neighbors' privacy. Continue spreading these wild tales, and you may find your medical practice suffering accordingly." His smile returned, but it did not reach his eyes. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual criminals to deal with." As Blackwood left the magistrate's office, he noted a carriage waiting outside, a black conveyance with the Bellamy crest emblazoned on its door. The driver sat motionless on the box, his face partially concealed by the brim of his hat, but Blackwood could feel the man's eyes following him as he walked away. The message was clear. The cult's influence reached into the very institutions that should have opposed it, and his efforts to seek help through official channels had only alerted his enemies to his intentions. Realizing he would have to act alone, Blackwood began to prepare. From his medical supplies, he took a pistol, several scalpels, and a vial of laudanum, a tincture of opium that could render a man unconscious if administered in sufficient quantity. These he packed carefully in a leather satchel, alongside bandages and other items that might prove useful in treating injuries. From Reverend Sullivan, he borrowed a silver crucifix and a vial of holy water, though he doubted their efficacy against whatever ancient power the Bellamys served. Sullivan provided these items without question, his rheumy eyes suggesting he understood more than Blackwood had explicitly stated about his intentions. "May God protect you, my son," the elderly clergyman said as Blackwood prepared to leave. "And remember, even in the darkest night, faith can be a light to guide your path." Most importantly, he acquired a detailed map of the Raven's Rest property from a surveyor's office in Charleston. The clerk was initially reluctant to provide such information, but a generous consultation fee loosened his scruples. The map, yellowed with age but still legible, showed not only the main house and outbuildings but also the network of paths and roads that crisscrossed the plantation. Blackwood noted the location of the witch house and the various approaches to it, mentally calculating the best route for an unobserved approach. The days leading up to July 11th passed with excruciating slowness. Blackwood maintained his normal routine, seeing patients and attending social functions, all while feeling as if he were moving through a dream. The ordinary concerns of Charleston society, gossip about engagements and business deals, discussions of politics and fashion, seemed impossibly trivial compared to the horror he knew was unfolding at Raven's Rest. Several times he found himself staring at his fellow guests at dinners or card parties, wondering which of them might be members of the Order of the Eternal Dawn, which seemingly respectable citizen might have participated in the rituals Thomas had described. He made one final attempt to contact Thomas, sending a carefully worded note via a former slave who now worked as a free man delivering messages and small packages throughout the Charleston area. The note, ostensibly about a medical text Thomas had expressed interest in, contained a coded message suggesting a meeting place where they might discuss escape plans. The messenger returned with no response, reporting that he had been turned away at the gates of Raven's Rest by guards who seemed unusually alert and suspicious. On the night of July 10th, Blackwood rode out from Charleston, timing his journey to reach Raven's Rest after midnight. He wore dark clothing, his face smudged with ash to reduce its visibility in the moonlight. The pistol was loaded and primed, tucked into his waistband within easy reach. In his pockets were the vials of laudanum and holy water, along with a small pouch of salt, an element the journal had mentioned as being anathema to the entities the cult worshipped. The night was oppressively hot, typical of Carolina in July. Cicadas droned in the trees, their rhythmic pulsing creating an alien soundscape that seemed appropriate to Blackwood's mission. The sky was clear, stars blazing with unusual intensity, as if the heavens themselves were observing the events unfolding below with particular interest. The moon, just past its last quarter, provided enough light to navigate by without exposing him unnecessarily. Raven's Rest emerged from the darkness as he approached, its white columns ghostly in the starlight. The main house was largely dark, with only a few windows illuminated on the lower floor. Blackwood avoided the main drive, instead circling through the fields until he reached a small copse of trees half a mile from the house. There, he tethered his horse, ensuring the animal had water from a nearby stream before continuing on foot. Moving from shadow to shadow, Blackwood made his way across the plantation grounds. The slave quarters were dark and silent, unusually so for a summer night when the inhabitants would typically be taking advantage of the cooler evening hours for socializing. No voices raised in conversation or song, no children playing in the dirt yards between cabins. The stillness was unnatural, suggesting that the occupants were either absent or restrained in some way. Following the map, Blackwood approached the witch house from the rear, using a line of decorative shrubs for cover. The stone building loomed before him, a squat, windowless structure that seemed to absorb the starlight. Despite the heat of the night, the air around the building felt noticeably cooler, as if it generated its own microclimate of perpetual autumn. A faint glow emanated from beneath the heavy wooden door, and as Blackwood crept closer, he could hear chanting from within, a rhythmic, guttural sound in no language he recognized. Finding a position behind a gnarled oak tree, Blackwood settled in to wait and watch. The chanting continued, rising and falling in patterns that seemed designed to induce a trance-like state in both participants and listeners. Despite his scientific skepticism, Blackwood found himself swaying slightly to the rhythm, his eyelids growing heavy as the alien syllables washed over him. With a start, he realized the danger. The chant itself was a form of hypnotic suggestion, drawing the unwary into a state of heightened susceptibility. He pinched the skin of his wrist sharply, using pain to break the spell, and stuffed small wads of cloth into his ears to muffle the sound. Throughout the remainder of the night, carriages arrived at intervals, their occupants hurrying into the witch house. Blackwood recognized several prominent Charleston citizens among them, a judge known for his harsh sentencing of slave rebellions, 2 wealthy merchants whose ships plied the Caribbean trade routes, the very magistrate who had dismissed his concerns days earlier, and most surprisingly, a clergyman from one of Charleston's most prestigious churches, his clerical collar clearly visible beneath his cloak. Each arrival followed the same pattern. The carriage would stop at a discreet distance from the witch house, the occupants would emerge and be greeted by a slave who appeared from nowhere, and then they would proceed to the building's entrance, where they performed a peculiar gesture, touching their foreheads, hearts, and the silver pendants most wore around their necks before entering. The carriages would then withdraw to the stables near the main house. The drivers, all slaves with the same blank expressions as those at Raven's Rest, moving with mechanical precision. As dawn approached, the chanting ceased, and the visitors departed, emerging from the witch house in small groups. Their faces bore expressions of ecstatic exhaustion, like revelers after a night of excessive indulgence. They spoke little, communicating mainly through meaningful glances and brief touches that suggested a shared experience beyond words. Each returned to their respective carriages, which departed at intervals carefully timed to avoid creating a noticeable procession on the road back to Charleston. Blackwood was about to retreat when the door opened once more, and Thaddeus emerged, followed by Nathaniel. Between them, they half-carried, half-dragged a man whose clothing marked him as a laborer. The man appeared unconscious or drugged, his head lolling as they pulled him toward a small outbuilding near the main house. His feet left twin furrows in the dew-damp earth, suggesting complete inability to support his own weight. Most disturbing was the network of shallow cuts visible on his exposed forearms and throat, ritual markings that matched the symbols Blackwood had observed throughout Raven's Rest. Once Thaddeus and Nathaniel had disappeared inside the outbuilding with their burden, Blackwood made his way back to his horse. The eastern sky was lightening, promising another scorching day. He would return that night, the night of the dark moon, and put an end to whatever horror the Bellamys had planned. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Blackwood tried to rest, knowing he would need his strength, but sleep eluded him. His mind raced with images from the night before. The procession of Charleston's elite entering the witch house, the ritualistic gestures, the chanting that seemed to pull at his consciousness. Most disturbing was the thought of Thomas, trapped in that house of horrors, awaiting a ceremony that would either transform or destroy him. When sleep finally claimed him in the early afternoon, Blackwood's dreams were invaded by visions more vivid than any he had experienced before. He saw the witch house from above, its roof transparent, revealing the circular chamber within. Robed figures moved around a central altar, their faces obscured by shadow despite the hundreds of candles that lined the walls. On the altar lay Thomas, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. Standing over him was Thaddeus, holding a curved dagger identical to the one Blackwood had seen in the study. Behind Thaddeus loomed a presence that defied description, a shifting mass of darkness that seemed to contain eyes, limbs, and mouths in configurations that changed moment by moment. Blackwood woke with a strangled gasp, his body drenched in sweat despite the cooling breeze from the open window. The dream had been so real, so immediate, that for a moment he feared he had somehow astrally projected himself to Raven's Rest, or worse, that something at Raven's Rest had reached out to him across the miles, touching his mind with visions designed to terrify or influence him. Shaking off the lingering effects of the nightmare, Blackwood returned to the documents from Edinburgh, searching for any information that might help him against the Order of the Eternal Dawn. One passage caught his attention, a section he had overlooked previously, perhaps because it seemed more like superstition than useful intelligence. The entities they worship cannot abide the presence of certain herbs and minerals. Chief among these is salt, which they claim burns the flesh of the older ones. Similarly, the smoke of burning sage disrupts their communion, and iron, particularly cold-forged iron, can dispel their manifestations. But their greatest vulnerability lies in their dependence on the celestial alignment. Should the ritual be interrupted at its apex, when the veil between worlds is thinnest, the backlash can destroy not only the manifestation, but those who summoned it. The journal went on to describe a failed ritual in Salem, where an unexpected solar eclipse had disrupted the carefully calculated alignment. The entity partially summoned had turned on its worshippers, consuming several before dissipating back to whatever dimension it called home. The survivors had been found wandering the woods, their minds shattered by the experience, babbling about the darkness that ate itself and eyes that saw inward. Armed with this knowledge, Blackwood gathered additional supplies, a pouch of salt, bundles of sage, and an iron fire poker borrowed from his landlady's hearth. The poker was an ungainly weapon, difficult to conceal, but if the journal was correct, it might prove more effective against whatever manifested in the witch house than his pistol or scalpels. As dusk fell, he penned a letter to Reverend Sullivan, detailing everything he had learned about the Order of the Eternal Dawn and the Bellamy's involvement. He sealed it with instructions that it should be opened and forwarded to authorities in Boston and Philadelphia if he did not return by noon the following day. This precaution likely wouldn't save him if his mission failed, but it might ensure that others would continue the investigation, potentially saving future victims. The journey to Raven's Rest seemed shorter this time, the road more familiar. The night was cloudy, the darkness nearly complete without moonlight. This suited Blackwood's purposes, providing better cover for his approach, though it made navigation more challenging. He relied on memory and occasional glimpses of stars between clouds to keep his bearings. The plantation was alive with activity when he arrived. Unlike the previous night when stealth had governed the proceedings, tonight Raven's Rest blazed with light. Torches lined the drive from the main gates to the house, and more illuminated the path from the main house to the witch house. Figures in hooded red robes moved between the buildings, carrying vessels of various sizes and bundles of what appeared to be herbs, or perhaps sacrificial animals. From his hiding place at the edge of the woods, Blackwood watched as a procession formed at the main house, Thaddeus at its head, followed by Constance, Nathaniel, and Victoria. Thaddeus wore robes of a deep crimson that appeared almost black in the torchlight, embroidered with gold symbols that matched those Blackwood had seen throughout Raven's Rest. On his head was a circlet of some dark metal, set with stones that gleamed with an inner light despite the darkness. Constance and Nathaniel wore similar robes in a slightly lighter shade, while Victoria's were pure white, suggesting a different role in the ceremony to come. Behind them came a dozen other robed figures, their faces concealed by deep hoods. From their height and bearing, Blackwood recognized several: the judge, the merchants, the magistrate, the clergyman. Others were strangers to him, though their confident stride and the deference shown to them by the Bellamy slaves suggested wealth and position. Each wore around their neck a silver pendant similar to those worn by the Bellamys, though perhaps less ornate. At the rear of the procession, two large men dragged a struggling Thomas. The boy was dressed in a simple white shift, his feet bare, his wrists bound before him with a cord that appeared to be made of braided hair. His face was contorted with terror as he fought against his captors, but the men, house slaves whose blank expressions never changed despite the boy's struggles, were implacable in their grip. "No!" Thomas screamed, his voice carrying clearly across the grounds. "I won't do it. You can't make me!" But his protests were ignored as the procession moved inexorably toward the witch house. Blackwood knew he had to act. Circling around through the underbrush, he positioned himself near the door of the stone building. As the procession approached, he could see that the interior was lit by hundreds of candles, their light revealing a large circular chamber. In the center stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with what could only be blood. Around the altar, symbols had been painted on the floor in red, complex spiraling patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. The air was thick with incense, a cloying scent that reminded Blackwood of the rotting flowers Parker had described. Beneath this artificial perfume was something else, a musty, organic odor like opened graves or disturbed crypts. It was the smell of decay, of matter breaking down and returning to its constituent elements, yet somehow alive in the process. The smell of death refusing to acknowledge its own finality. Thaddeus entered first, raising his arms as he crossed the threshold. The circlet on his head caught the candlelight, sending prismatic reflections dancing across the stone walls. "Brothers and sisters of the Order," he intoned, his voice carrying clearly to where Blackwood hid. "Tonight the stars align as they have not done in a century. Tonight the veil thins, and those who wait beyond will hear our call. Tonight we offer them the purest sacrifice, the blood of my line, freely given by one who has come of age." The assembled cultists murmured in response, a sound of anticipation and reverence. Several swayed slightly as if already entering a trance state in preparation for the ceremony to come. As they filed into the witch house, Blackwood caught glimpses of their faces beneath the hoods, expressions of ecstatic expectation, eyes dilated despite the bright candlelight, lips moving in silent prayers or invocations. Thomas was brought forward, still struggling. "It's not freely given," he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "I don't want this. Father, please." Thaddeus turned to his son, his face terrible in the candlelight. The normally handsome features seemed to shift subtly, becoming more angular, less human in their proportions. His eyes, always piercing, now glowed with an inner light that matched the stones in his circlet. "You will embrace your heritage, Thomas. The blood of our covenant has flowed through the Bellamy line for generations. Tonight you take your place among us." The boy was dragged toward the altar, his bare feet leaving smeared tracks in the symbols painted on the floor. As he passed Blackwood's position, their eyes met for the briefest moment, Thomas's widening in recognition and desperate hope. It was now or never. As Thomas was dragged toward the altar, Blackwood saw his opportunity. The last of the cultists had entered the building, leaving only the two men restraining Thomas near the door. Drawing his pistol, Blackwood stepped from the shadows and fired, striking one of the men in the shoulder. The report of the gun was deafening in the night air, a sharp crack that momentarily silenced even the insects in the surrounding fields. The wounded man fell, crying out in pain, a sound more animal than human. Blood blossomed on his robe, darkening the red fabric to black. As he collapsed, his hood fell back, revealing not one of the house slaves as Blackwood had assumed, but a middle-aged white man, a face Blackwood recognized from Charleston society but could not immediately place. Before the second guard could react, Blackwood rushed forward, swinging the iron poker at the man's temple. The heavy metal connected with a sickening crunch, dropping him instantly. This one was indeed one of the Bellamy slaves, his blank expression never changing even as consciousness fled. He crumpled to the ground like a puppet with cut strings, limbs akimbo in a posture no living man would maintain. Chaos erupted within the witch house. The gunshot had alerted the cultists, and several turned toward the door, their movements slowed by shock and the hypnotic effects of the incense and chanting. Thaddeus spun toward the entrance, his face contorted with rage. The circlet on his head flared with sudden brightness, the stones pulsing like malevolent stars. "Seize him!" he commanded, and several robed figures moved to obey, drawing daggers from within their robes. These were not the mindless slaves Blackwood had encountered before, but fully conscious members of the order, their eyes burning with fanatical hatred for the intruder who threatened their sacred ceremony. Thomas, momentarily free, ran to Blackwood's side. The boy's face was pale but determined, the terror of moments before replaced by desperate hope. "You came," he gasped, clutching at Blackwood's arm with his bound hands. "You actually came." "Stay behind me," Blackwood ordered, drawing a scalpel with his free hand while keeping the pistol trained on the advancing cultists. The blade gleamed in the candlelight, small but wickedly sharp, capable of inflicting precise and devastating wounds if necessary. "When I create an opening, run for the trees. My horse is tethered in the grove east of here." The cultists hesitated, eyeing the pistol and the wickedly sharp scalpel. Even in their altered state of consciousness, they recognized the threat of immediate physical harm. They spread out, attempting to flank Blackwood and Thomas, seeking an angle of attack that would minimize their own risk. Their movements were coordinated without explicit communication, suggesting a hive mind quality to their consciousness, or perhaps long practice in working as a unit. Thaddeus pushed his way through them, his eyes burning with an inhuman light. "Dr. Blackwood," he said, his voice unnaturally calm despite the disruption to his ceremony. "You disappoint me. I had hoped you might join us. Victoria spoke highly of your potential." "I've seen enough to know what you are," Blackwood replied, backing slowly toward the door, keeping Thomas behind him. The night air at his back was a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere within the witch house, thick with incense and the breath of too many people in too small a space. "Murderers, deluded fools who sacrifice others for your own gain." Thaddeus smiled, a chilling expression devoid of warmth. His teeth seemed too numerous, too sharp in the candlelight, like those of a predatory fish rather than a man. "Not for our gain alone, Doctor. What we do serves a greater purpose. The older ones reward their faithful. They have given us wealth, power, long life. They could give you the same." As he spoke, Thaddeus removed his circlet, holding it before him like an offering. The stone set in the dark metal pulsed with an inner light, rhythmic as heartbeats but unsynchronized, creating a disorienting visual effect. "This was a gift from beyond the veil," he said, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "It allows the wearer to perceive realities beyond the mundane, to see potentials and possibilities that ordinary men can never glimpse. Put it on, Doctor, and understand what we offer." "At what cost?" Blackwood demanded, resisting the compulsion to reach for the circlet despite feeling its pull. "The lives of innocents? The soul of your own son?" "Soul?" Thaddeus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "A Christian concept, Doctor. The older ones teach us that there is only flesh and the power that animates it. That power can be harnessed, transferred, preserved. What you call the soul is merely energy, and energy can be consumed." As he spoke, something changed in the air of the chamber. The candlelight dimmed, though the flames still burned, and shadows deepened in the corners. A low humming vibration filled the space, more felt than heard, resonating in Blackwood's bones and teeth. The temperature dropped precipitously, his breath suddenly visible as steam in the chill. "They come," Constance whispered from beside the altar, her eyes wide with ecstasy. Her hands were raised above her head, fingers splayed as if reaching for something only she could see. They sensed the alignment. Behind her, the shadows on the wall began to move independent of any light source. They stretched and twisted, forming shapes that defied human anatomy, limbs that bent at impossible angles, appendages that served no recognizable purpose, mouths where eyes should be, and eyes where no sensory organ had any right to exist. Thaddeus turned back to the altar. "We have no time for this distraction. Nathaniel, Victoria, prepare your brother. The moment approaches." Nathaniel moved toward Blackwood and Thomas, his face set in grim determination. Victoria hesitated, her eyes meeting Blackwood's with an expression he couldn't decipher. "Victoria," Blackwood said softly, "you know this is wrong. Help us." For a moment she seemed torn. Then, with a fluid motion, she reached beneath her robe and withdrew a dagger, the same curved blade Blackwood had seen in Thaddeus's study. But instead of advancing on Blackwood, she turned and plunged the dagger into Nathaniel's chest. "Run!" she screamed to Blackwood and Thomas. "I'll hold them off." Nathaniel staggered backward, blood blossoming on his robe. The other cultists stood frozen in shock. Thaddeus roared with rage, lunging toward his daughter. Blackwood seized the moment, pulling Thomas through the door. As they ran into the night, he glanced back to see Victoria standing in the doorway, her arms spread wide as if to block pursuit. Behind her, shadows were coalescing into something massive and shapeless, something with too many limbs and too many eyes. "Don't look back!" Blackwood shouted to Thomas as they sprinted toward the trees. "Just run!" They raced across the open ground between the witch house and the woods, vulnerable and exposed in the torchlight. Behind them, pursuit was organizing, shouts and the pounding of feet indicating that at least some of the cultists had recovered from their shock and were giving chase. A pistol shot rang out, the ball whistling past Blackwood's ear close enough that he felt the disturbance in the air. Another shot followed, this one striking the ground near Thomas's feet, sending up a spray of dirt. The boy stumbled, nearly falling, but Blackwood caught his arm and kept him moving. Thomas's breathing was labored, his face pale with exertion and terror. "I can't," he gasped. "Too weak. The preparation ritual. They drugged me." "You can," Blackwood insisted, half dragging the boy forward. "Just a little further. The trees will give us cover." They reached the edge of the woods, plunging into darkness as the canopy overhead blotted out the starlight. Now they ran blind, guided only by Blackwood's memory of the path he had taken earlier. Branches whipped at their faces, roots threatened to trip them, but they pressed on, driven by the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. "This way," Blackwood hissed, pulling Thomas down a shallow ravine that offered a more concealed route through the woods. The ground was muddy here, their footprints clearly visible, but it couldn't be helped. Speed was more important than stealth now that their escape had been discovered. They reached the grove where Blackwood had left his horse, the animal nickering nervously as they approached. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had momentarily faded. The cultists had either lost their trail in the darkness or split up to cover more ground. Either way, it offered a brief respite. As Blackwood helped Thomas onto the horse, a tremor shook the ground beneath their feet. It was not the familiar sensation of an earthquake, with its rolling motion, but something more localized and directed, as if a massive object had been dropped from a great height. The horse whinnied in fear, nearly throwing Thomas from its back. Turning, they saw the witch house illuminated from within by an unearthly light that pulsed and writhed. The light was not a single color, but a nauseating spectrum that included hues no human eye was meant to perceive. Colors that suggested geometries and dimensions beyond normal comprehension. Shadows stretched from the building like tentacles, reaching toward the main house and beyond, blacker than the night around them, seeming to devour rather than merely block the distant torchlight. "What's happening?" Thomas gasped, his face illuminated by the distant, impossible light. Despite Blackwood's warning, the boy couldn't tear his gaze from the spectacle unfolding at the witch house. "I don't know," Blackwood admitted, mounting behind Thomas and taking the reins. "But we need to get as far from here as possible." As he spoke, a terrible scream split the night. Victoria's voice, filled with agony and something else. Triumph. The sound seemed to go on, beyond the capacity of human lungs, becoming higher and more alien until it passed beyond the range of human hearing, leaving only a pressure in their ears and a sense of dread that settled like a stone in their stomachs. The light from the witch house intensified, shooting upward in a pillar that pierced the clouded sky. Where the beam touched the clouds, they began to rotate, forming a vortex that descended toward the building like the finger of an accusing god. Wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the scent of ozone and something else. The same cloying, rotting flower smell that had permeated the witch house, but stronger now, more invasive, seeming to coat the inside of their throats and lungs with each breath. "The ritual," Thomas said, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. "It's gone wrong. Victoria's sacrifice. It wasn't part of the pattern. The older ones. They're coming through, but there's no control, no direction." Another tremor shook the ground, stronger than the first. In the distance, they could hear screams. Human voices raised in terror as the shadows from the witch house reached the main house and the slave quarters beyond. The darkness moved with purpose, enveloping buildings and people alike, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. "We have to go," Blackwood said, digging his heels into the horse's flanks. "Now." They rode hard through the night, not slowing until they reached Charleston just before dawn. The city was stirring, early risers beginning their day's work, unaware of the horror unfolding some 20 miles to the northwest. Blackwood took Thomas directly to Reverend Sullivan's home, where the boy collapsed from exhaustion and terror. Once Thomas was settled, Blackwood told the Reverend everything that had occurred at Raven's Rest. "The ritual was interrupted at its apex," Sullivan murmured, his gnarled hands clasped in prayer. The old man's face was grave, the lines etched deeper by the early morning light filtering through his study windows. "If what you read is correct, the consequences for the order could be dire. And for anyone else at Raven's Rest," Blackwood added grimly. He was exhausted, his body aching from the night's exertions, but his mind remained alert, processing what he had witnessed. Those shadows, they weren't discriminating between cultists and